Hello brothers and sisters, and welcome back to the channel. And we're moving right along with our NFL Week 2 predictions. And we're going to start things off with the 1 o'clock games. We got the Dallas Cowboys taking on their other divisional opponent in the Washington Redskins. They head to the nation's capital to take on Case Keenum, who surprisingly gave the Philadelphia Eagles a pretty good game yesterday. They even had the lead for a good portion of the first half, and then Carson Wentz and Deshaun Jackson just went off on them. New passing weapons in Amari Cooper and Randall Cobb to very good use. Michael Gallup, I should mention, as well, had a really great game for the Cowboys. And this Cowboys team is heading into Washington looking awfully impressive, and it's pretty hard to pick against them in this game. The Redskins looked at times like a pretty good team. However, I would hesitate to say that they were good or are going to be anything more than a potentially 6-10, 7-9 football team. But at the end of the day, I mean, the Cowboys just looked so good against the Giants. And I don't really know what the Redskins have on defense that could slow down Dak Prescott or Ezekiel Elliott. And you couple that with the fact that wide receiving core is stacked now. The addition of Randall Cobb and Amari Cooper playing the way that he played last week, as well as Michael Gallup coming in as a big time, putting up big time numbers from the number 3 spot. This is a very potent looking Dallas offense. I think the Cowboys win this game. I'm giving them the dub on this one. Let's move on. The next game up is another divisional game between the Indianapolis Colts and the Tennessee Titans. And kind of like the Cowboys-Redskins game, this is also a team coming in flying sky high, while the other team coming off a tough loss. The Indianapolis Colts put up a very valiant effort against a really formidable Chargers team, put together an inspired fourth quarter comeback to force overtime, but unfortunately could not get the job done on defense to win in overtime. And meanwhile, the Tennessee Titans coming off a tremendous showing in Cleveland, where they absolutely spanked the perpetually hyped up Cleveland Browns team, kind of sending Cleveland as a city back down to earth after all the offseason hype about their team. When I was doing my picks for Week 1 last week on Facebook Live, I completely overlooked them, thought they were a mediocre team that was going to get steamrolled by the Cleveland Brown hype train, and I just want to give my sincerest apologies to Tennessee Titans fans for overlooking you and assuming that you just lay down for Baker Mayfield, because that was a mistake. But part of what always makes me skeptical with the Titans is that, like I said, it's consistency. Even if you go back to the last 2 seasons they had, for every great game that they've played, they also have a real stinker in their season, and that's the thing that keeps me from fully buying into this team. So that'll be the narrative for me to watch with the Titans, and for Marcus Mariota, who kind of like Jameis Winston is kind of in his last chance to prove that he's worthy of that number 1 overall pick. Well, on the other side of the ball, they were looking for that feel-good story last week after the Andrew Luck retirement, overcoming that and getting a win against a strong Chargers team. They didn't get it, but there's definitely no shame in that game that they played. They played a really strong game, and I think it's going to get overlooked, especially on the defensive side, which was great in my opinion. Phillip Rivers was rarely comfortable in that game. And look, if this team misses Andrew Luck that sorely, they sure did not show it in that game, because they were moving the ball pretty effectively against Chargers defense that was one of the top of the league last year. The Colts will have to face another pretty tough defense in the Titans, though, who absolutely worked over the Browns last week. Tennessee, in my opinion, has one of the most underrated secondaries in the league as well, with Kevin Byard and Malcolm Butler. Yeah, I kind of want to pick the Colts for the upset on this one, but I think the Colts. I'm going with the Colts for the upset. So moving on from that, we got the Seahawks going into Pittsburgh to take on the reeling Pittsburgh Steelers. We're coming off an absolute butt-whooping at the hands of Tom Brady and the Patriots. Seahawks, kind of a bit of a scare last week. You had a Bengals team come in that no one had any expectations for. I thought in my Facebook Live predictions that the Hawks were just going to blow them out of the water. You had a terrible O-line in the Bengals come in, and he just adds Jadeveon Clowney to your defensive line, which is already pretty good at rushing the quarterback, and Andy Dalton throws for over 400 yards on you, and you only win that game by 1 point. That is something to be concerned about if I'm a Seahawks fan. But on the other side of the ball, I mean, the Steelers got absolutely smacked in every way possible against the Patriots. And yeah, it's the Patriots, but I mean, come on, that was embarrassing. Do the Steelers have a bounce-back game here against the Seahawks? Well, if I'm the Steelers, I mean, the Seahawks are definitely not a great team to have to face when you're looking for a bounce-back game, especially when your starting center went down in the last game with an injury. One of your top pass rushers in TJ Watt also went down with an injury against New England. And Juju Smith-Schuster limped off the field last week. So none of these are good signs for the Pittsburgh Steelers. If anything, I'm looking for a bounce-back game from the Seattle pass rush because this is another weak-looking offensive line that is now being depleted by injuries. If Jadeveon Clowney was going to pick a game to really make his mark in Seattle, this would be it. And the Pittsburgh receiving corps looked absolutely lost without Antonio Brown. And that's not even taking into account the defensive side of the ball, which got absolutely smoked by Tom Brady and the Patriots last week. It was an absolute embarrassment on both sides of the ball for the Pittsburgh Steelers, and it's one that's really hard to come back from. That's just a demoralizing defeat for any football team, and it's one that greatly hurts your playoff chances. And I think Seattle feels like they're coming into this game. They dodged a bullet against Cincinnati, and now they have the Pittsburgh Steelers, who are still licking their wounds from last week. I gotta go with the Seahawks on this one. And that brings us to my team, the Bills, going back to MetLife Stadium for the second week in a row to take on the New York Giants. And the Giants on defense looked terrible against Dallas last week. And part of that may just because Dallas is that good, but I mean, you look at this defensive roster for the Giants, I mean, they're really starved for talent. And the Bills, kind of like the Seahawks, dodged a bullet last week against the Jets. They turned the ball over 4 times and were able to come back in the fourth quarter, score 17 unanswered points, and win the game by 1 point. So they escaped MetLife with a win last week. They escaped Week 1 with a win. 2 things to note for the Bills. 1, look for Devin Singletary to get many more touches in this game. And 2, look for John Brown to have another big game, because if this Giants secondary plays the way that they did last week, they're in for another long game. I'm picking the Bills to win this one. If I had to make a case for the Giants, though, I mean, Eli Manning, he didn't look he didn't look that bad for his age last week. His offensive line did a pretty good job protecting him last week. On defense for the Bills, I would expect to see a pretty similar game plan to what the Jets had, which is feed the running back as much as you possibly can, throw the ball underneath for these check down throws. And if that's the case, then I think the Bills should be able to handle the Giants pretty easily. Knock on wood, because if I've learned anything from my years of being a Bills fan, is that it's never easy. That brings us next to the Patriots and the Dolphins, and oh boy. Look, this segment is going to be more of a rant than it's going to be a prediction or a breakdown, because I have a bone to pick with both these teams. But I'm just going to get it out of the way. Obviously, the Patriots are going to win this one. It's not even going to be close. It's not even a question. There's no case I can make for the Miami Dolphins after the performance that they put up last week that they're going to have any chance of winning this game. But I have some feelings about the Miami Dolphins. I also have some feelings about the New England Patriots and the moves they've made in the past week. So I'm gonna start with the Dolphins, because the Dolphins, should be ashamed of themselves. This is an absolute travesty, in my opinion. I mean, last week was embarrassing. You got absolutely creamed on your home field by the Baltimore Ravens in front of your home fans. I know the Dolphins are trying to tank, but do they have to be so blatant about it? I get teams tank. That's not... I hate the trend of tanking, but that's not why I'm upset here. What I'm mad about, is how unashamedly and how blatantly they are trying to tank. They're not even trying to hide it. 2 weeks before the season started, they traded away their best wide receiver and their best starting left tackle. I mean, how can you justify that move other than you're just throwing in the towel for an entire season? And that's before week 1. And then you couple that with the reports coming out of the Miami locker room after you got your ass kicked by Baltimore that players are calling their agents to get traded out of Miami. You're doing such a bad job at hiding the fact that you're tanking that even your players are aware of the fact that you're tanking, and they don't want any part of it. So I guess my question to the Miami... I don't put this on the players because they're doing the best they can, and honestly, if I were a player on that team, I wouldn't want to be there either. And I don't even necessarily blame the coach because it's his first year, and you can only play with the cards you're dealt. And I don't blame Brian Flores in his first year coming in here with a roster that has been stripped to the bone of any talent that of course you're going to lose in your first season. I mean, what did you expect? My issue is with this GM and with this front office that seems perfectly okay with creating a culture of losing that's so bad that no player wants to be a part of it. This is not just a season that's so bad that it gets you the number 1 pick. This is the kind of season that can derail a franchise for many seasons in the future. Look at the Buffalo Sabres. In 2015, they blew it all up, and they tried to tank for Connor McDavid. They didn't get Connor McDavid. They had to settle for Jack Eichel. But after 2015, that was when the tank was over, and they were going to try to start winning again. Well, look at where we are now. The 2020 season is about to start, and the Sabres haven't been any better this year than they have been since 2015. And it's all because they decided to start tanking and to intentionally lose so they could get the best player in the draft. And look how that worked out for them. They didn't get the best player in the draft, and they're still losing 5 years later. That's how I think the Miami Dolphins are going to be after this season, and it would serve them right. And I sincerely hope that happens so it sends a message to future GMs that tanking doesn't work and that it should be frowned upon in the league to try and lose, because it creates a culture of losing that permeates the entire organization, and the players don't want to be a part of that. No free agent that you're going to potentially sign this offseason is going to want to be a part of that. Once you've established a losing culture in any sports organization, it's really hard to shake your way out of that. And that's exactly what the Miami Dolphins are doing. And I honestly think that 5 years down the road, the Miami Dolphins are still going to be the same franchise that they are now, absolutely mired in futility, wondering how they can possibly get out of this rut that they're in. It's an absolute disaster in Miami. Alright, that was much longer than I had anticipated. Let's move on. So after that bit of rage, we're going to cool things down here by talking about the Jaguars and the Houston Texans. The Houston Texans played an outstanding football game. As of recording this, it was yesterday on Monday Night Football. Just did a great job. They gave the Saints all they could handle. Deshaun Watson played an outstanding football game, but he was just outdone at the end by Drew Brees. On the other side of the coin, you had the Jaguars, who were coming off a tough Week 1 loss. They lost their starting quarterback, Nick Foles, which hurts. And now Gardner Minshew II will be starting for him, it looks like. And I don't see it. I mean, I know he looks good against the Chiefs, and that's not to be discounted, but I don't see them beating the Texans. To make the case for the Jaguars, Deshaun Watson did get banged up pretty good in the Saints game. There's always the chance that he might not be completely 100% in this game. And honestly, the Houston Texans, this is a really sorry-looking offensive line that has made no improvements from a season ago where Deshaun Watson was just running for his life on every play. And they're going up against the Jacksonville Jaguars, who usually have a pretty good pass rush, but they didn't last week. So this is a tough one to call. It really comes down to, do the Jaguars' defense get back to where they were expected to be after getting absolutely carved up by Patrick Mahomes? It's a scary thought for Jags fans, to be sure, because defense was supposed to be this team's strength, and if it's not, then this team is really not going to go anywhere this season. I think the Texans get back on their horse after a heartbreaking loss to the Saints, and I think they get the W on this one. So that's going to bring us to yet another divisional matchup between the Minnesota Vikings and the Green Bay Packers. The Green Bay Packers, they're coming off a nice long week. They're coming off a solid, albeit pretty ugly win over the Chicago Bears. Their defense put up a great performance. They definitely look like it could be the real deal. The Vikings are also coming off a very impressive Week 1 win over the Atlanta Falcons at home. And in my Facebook Live predictions last week, I picked the Falcons to win that game because I did not trust Kirk Cousins as a quarterback. From the looks of things, neither do the Vikings, because they only let Cousins throw the ball 10 times in that game. And he only completed 8 passes. Now, granted, those 8 completions went for went for like 185 yards or something, I think. So it's definitely nothing to sneeze at, but I think it's pretty telling that the Vikings' game plan last week was to let Cousins pass the ball as little as possible. And Dalvin Cook, take nothing away from him, had a great game last week, but the real star of that show was their defense, who through 3 quarters just absolutely stifled what was expected to be a high-powered Falcons offense. So I see this being a very good defensive battle. I think the Packers, if they're going to win this one, are going to have to win another low-scoring game like they did against the Bears. Again, it's coming down to quarterbacks for me. I trust Aaron Rodgers to get this win more than I trust Kirk Cousins to get this win. And you look back on seasons past in this matchup, he's done it before. I think he'll do it again. I think the Packers, they just squeak out of this one. Next up, we have the Chargers heading to the Motor City to take on the Lions. 2 teams with very similar-looking Week 1s. Both blew a fourth-quarter lead that forced overtime. The only difference is the Chargers were actually able to regroup and win in their overtime, whereas the Detroit Lions were played to a tie by the Arizona Cardinals. Now, one point of concern for the Los Angeles Chargers in this game was that their defense, which a season ago was one of the better defensive units in the league, looked pretty vulnerable in that game against the Colts. I said in the Colts segment that they moved the ball pretty effectively against this Chargers defense, and that is a point of concern, because if this defense doesn't play as well or better than they did last season, then I don't see this team going very far. But that being said, they got a good win last week. They did a good job closing out the game last week when things looked like they were getting away from them. Phillip Rivers is still Phillip Rivers, and Austin Eckler looked like an absolute beast in the stead of Melvin Gordon. This is an offense that definitely has some weapons and can definitely give the Detroit Lions a really hard time. Whereas the Lions are coming off a game that they probably should have won. They tied with the Arizona Cardinals, a team that everybody thought was dead in the water. If you ask me which team came out better out of a tie, it's definitely the Cardinals, because they have a rookie quarterback who just brought them back from a fourth quarter deficit to tie the game, and they couldn't close it out in overtime. But that's definitely a positive for the Cardinals, whereas if you're the Lions, you're the team that blew a fourth quarter lead and tied with the Arizona Cardinals. But that being said, though, you can't understate, TJ Hawkinson looks like a beast. Matt Stafford is always solid. The offensive line is going to have its work cut out for them, but from what I saw, they played a pretty solid game against the Cardinals. For me, it's going to be whether the Chargers defense can get back on track after a pretty shaky-looking week 1, and I'm going to go ahead and say that they do, and I'm going to say that they win this game. To the 49ers and the Cincinnati Bengals. The Bengals, make no mistake, their narrative for this season has changed. Even though they lost in Seattle, they went into Seattle, one of the toughest places to play in the league, and they gave that team and that defense especially all they could handle, and they almost escaped with a win. So the Bengals are definitely a frisky team. They're definitely not someone you can look past. And if you're the San Francisco 49ers, you're coming off a pretty solid-looking win against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. You especially feel good about your defense, who returned 2 interceptions for touchdowns last week. And they also had a pass rush that was able to affect Jameis Winston pretty good throughout the game. So these are definitely encouraging signs for the 49ers. Their defense a week ago was pitiful, especially in the takeaway category, and they already have 2 pick sixes on the season, so that looks better already. But on offense, this is a major question mark for me still, because if you take away those 2 interceptions that are run back for touchdowns, they only managed to score 17 points, and they should have scored probably 31 points, but they just could not get out of their own way, committing penalties and dropping balls. It was not a good-looking game for the 49ers offense, and quite frankly, they were lucky to escape Tampa with a win. But the Bengals, I feel like, should be riding high after a much better than expected showing in Seattle. And for a defense, too, that also looked a lot better than expected. I don't think there was much expectation for this Cincinnati defense, but they looked really good, and Russell Wilson was pressured a good number of times, and he was brought down a good number of times by that Bengals pass rush. So if I'm the 49ers and I'm Jimmy G, Jimmy G's not Russell Wilson. He's not going to be running around extending plays as much. The Niners are definitely going to have to work on protecting Jimmy G. I'm up in the air on this one, though. I don't know who to pick, because there's a strong case to be made for both sides. It is in Cincinnati. It really comes down to which defense do I trust more. Andy Dalton led the league in week 1 in passing yards against what is a pretty formidable Seattle defense. But I'm going to go out on a limb here, and I'm going to say I think the Bengals get this win. The case that I have to make is that Jameis Winston beat the Buccaneers last week and not the 49ers, and I don't think that's going to be the case. I think Andy Dalton is usually a pretty sound decision maker, and I think he's going to do just enough to win this game for the Bengals. And that brings us to the Cardinals and the Ravens. The Cardinals coming off a pretty uplifting, valiant effort against the Lions, where they played them to a tie. Kyler Murray had a noble performance, especially in the first quarter, throwing for over 300 yards. Larry Fitzgerald still showed that he can ball, even after all this time that he's been in the league. I don't see, even with all that coming into this game, I don't see how you can pick against the Baltimore Ravens after the way they just laid the smack down on the Miami Dolphins. The Ravens are not the Lions, and they're not going to be blowing a fourth quarter lead to force overtime this time around. So I think despite last week's feel-good story with Kyler Murray, I think the Ravens put an end to that and they get the W. That brings us to the 4 o'clock games, which starts with the Chiefs taking on the Raiders. The Raiders coming off a very impressive Monday night performance against the Denver Broncos, whereas the Chiefs coming off an equally impressive performance against the Jacksonville Jaguars. Both of these offenses absolutely carved up to what were thought to be very impressive defenses. Pat Mahomes was just making mincemeat out of the Jaguars secondary, and Derek Carr was also just picking apart the Broncos secondary. This is a tough game to call. The Raiders, for what it's worth, looked pretty good defensively. There's also the case to be made that Joe Flacco isn't the quarterback he used to be. It's really hard to win in this league anymore, just throwing check down passes and not taking shots downfield, and that's exactly what the Broncos did against the Raiders. But that's not what you're going to see against the Chiefs. Mahomes is an air-it-out, balls-to-the-wall quarterback, and they're going to be going for deep balls. And the Raiders have shown both last season and the season before that they are not very well equipped to stop that. And they lost Gareon Connolly in that game. He went down to injury, so he's a question mark going into this game. So already this is a depleted secondary if he's not able to go. I think the Chiefs beat the Raiders in this game. That brings us to the Saints taking on the Rams in a rematch of that infamous NFC Championship game, which saw the no call heard around the world that sent the Rams to the Super Bowl and not the Saints. This is going to be a really great matchup. Both teams coming off extraordinary performances. The Saints, just yesterday as I'm recording this, pulled off an absolutely thrilling victory, a come-from-behind victory too, whereas the Rams were able to stave off a surging Panthers offense. So both of these teams coming off a solid-looking Week 1 wins. I would give the edge to the Saints just on quarterback play alone because I really love what Drew Brees is doing right now. When that team needs a big play, he's able to come through for him. He came through for them on Monday. I think he'll come through for them again against the Rams. I think the Saints win this game and they get revenge for the NFC Championship game a year ago. That's going to bring us to the Chicago Bears taking on the Denver Broncos. Really a tale of two offenses that failed to get out of the gate in Week 1. The Bears obviously failed to score a touchdown against the Packers, and Joe Flacco and the Broncos just got absolutely worked over by the Raiders' defense. Now, the case to be made here is that the Bears have a better defense than the Raiders, and they, at least on paper, and they proved that on the field against the Packers, even though they lost on Thursday night. And on the other side of the ball, you had the Broncos, whose defense really didn't look that good at all. At no point was Derek Carr under pressure in that Monday night game, and he was able to just pick them apart like cotton candy down the stretch. The question is, do I think the poor Week 1 performance by the Bronco defense is a fluke, or do I think it's going to become the norm for this team? Because really this Broncos team is going as far as their defense is going to take them, because they're certainly not going anywhere because Joe Flacco's not taking them anywhere. They don't really have any big receiving threats that he can throw to. He doesn't have any deep threats either, except maybe for Cortland Sutton, who had an outstanding game against the Raiders, making him one of the few Broncos on that offense who did. Whereas the Chicago offense also struggled in Week 1 to get anything going. I mean, Allen Robinson had a strong game, and David Montgomery did good things with the limited touches that he saw in Week 1. But other than that, where's the weapons for Mitch Trubisky? Tariq Cohen's still a pretty good running back, but he's being utilized more in the passing game than he is in the run game. So this is a tough one to call for me because both of these teams pretty thoroughly failed to live up to expectations in Week 1. One of these teams is going to have to bounce back and right the ship in Week 2. And if I had to pick from the two of them, which I do and I'm going to, I have more faith in the Bears to bounce back and beat the Broncos here. I don't think that poor offensive performance by the Broncos was an aberration. I think that is going to be how this team is going to look throughout the entire season on offense. It's just going to be a matter of whether that defense is able to bounce back from a pretty pitiful performance against the Raiders, a team who I thought they were going to beat. So that brings us to the Eagles and the Falcons, two NFC foes going at it. The Falcons got absolutely embarrassed at times by a very game Minnesota Vikings defense. Matt Ryan was never comfortable. The offensive line got absolutely pancaked for most of the game. And Julio Jones was a non-factor last week. I mean, let's be honest. And the Eagles are coming off a very solid Week 1 performance. And while things certainly weren't perfect in that game, they fell behind early to Washington. They were still able to right the ship thanks to the Wentz-Deshaun Jackson connection and pull away pretty easy victory, I would say. It wasn't easy for long, but by the end of it, they weren't really even in any danger of losing that game. Although there is something to be concerned about for the Eagles, so the fact that you gave up, 30 points to the Redskins. I mean, that's not good. It's especially not good when you think of the fact that you're going up against the Atlanta Falcons, who over the last few seasons have had one of the top offenses in the league. And they still got Julio Jones, who is eventually going to break out and have a monster game, as he always does. But I think this has potential to be a pretty good offensive shootout. I don't know what the Eagles have in terms of a running game. You look at Dalvin Cook's performance against Atlanta, and that's definitely something that you might be looking to exploit. But I do know what they have in a passing game, though, and what they have is Deshaun Jackson. And Deshaun Jackson is exactly what this Eagles offense needed, which was a legitimate deep threat for Carson Wentz to just throw bombs to, and that's exactly what he did in Week 1. And I would not be surprised if he continues to do that all the way to the Super Bowl this year. I think the Eagles win this game, but I think it's going to be a high-scoring offensive shootout. And that brings us to the Monday night game. The Eagles-Falcons is Sunday night. The Monday night game will be the Cleveland Browns taking on the New York Jets. Now, if you remember correctly, last season, the last time these two teams played each other in prime time, the Cleveland Browns still had yet to win a game in a full season, and they won their first game in 1 year against the New York Jets. So that'll definitely be a monkey on the back of the New York Jets. Another monkey on the back of the New York Jets will be the fact that they had a 16-0 lead over the Buffalo Bills last week at home and failed to close it out. Now, this is another home game for the Jets, and the Cleveland Browns are also coming off an extremely disappointing outing against the Titans, where they just got absolutely outclassed and outplayed in every aspect of the game. The offensive line for the Browns was just absolutely horrendous last week, and they're coming in against the Jets front seven that can definitely get after quarterbacks if you let them. So this has potential to be a very long night for Baker Mayfield if that offensive line does what I think it's going to do, and that's get overrun by the Jets front seven. Now on the other hand, the Jets, for as good as the Jets' pass rush is, they have a secondary that's incredibly weak. And while I would hesitate to say that they got carved up by Josh Allen and the Bills last week, they definitely didn't do them any favors. They had some bad penalties, one of which negated an interception that would have set the Jets up in pretty good field position to add to their lead at that point. They had dropped interceptions, they had some blown coverages, and when it came down the stretch and the Bills were starting to make their comeback and they needed to get a big stop, they failed to come through and get a big stop for their team. And now they're going up against a Browns offense that has a ton of receiving weapons, which includes Jarvis Landry, it includes Odell Beckham Jr., and it includes David Njoku, who I think is one of the most underrated tight ends in the league. This is another interesting game that's tough to call for me, but the more I think about it, the less tough it is for me to call, because I'm looking on the other side of the ball, and while the Cleveland defense was not good last week against the Titans, as the rest of the team was, the Jets offense looked equally bad against the Bills. And I don't want to take anything away from my Bills, because they played great defense, and when they needed big stops, they got big stops. But the Jets' offensive game plan in that game was to feed Le'Veon Bell, and it was to throw checkdowns till kingdom come to Jamison Crowder, who had 14 receptions in that game and still failed to exceed 100 yards gained. That is insane. That has never happened before in the history of the league either. I just found that out today. But yeah, that kind of game plan is increasingly more difficult to win with in today's NFL. And if they try to do that against the Browns, then I think it plays very well into the hands of the Browns defense. I think the Browns bounce back, and I think they win this game. Oh boy, that was a lot of games. So thank you very much for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe to the channel, that would definitely help me a lot, and I'd be more than grateful. I hope you enjoy the games this week, and as always, have a blessed weekend, and we will see you in the next video. I would say I'm still working on that outro, but the outro for me today is Let's Go Bills!